Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Story Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, legislators meet in a rare veto override session. How close were the votes? What was the governor's reaction? And will this change the balance of power? Officials are still counting signatures, but Utahns may see as many as 4 ballot initiatives this November. Which measures are garnering the most support? How are special interests weighing in? And Utah's convention season has officially begun. Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Boyd Matheson, opinion editor for the Deseret News, Jennifer Napier Pierce, editor of the Salt Lake Tribune, and Rich McKeon, co-founder and chairman of Levitt Partners. So glad to have you with us today. Big week in politics, lots of things happening, but Jennifer, we're going to start with you. A veto override session. Our legislature met this week, which doesn't happen very often. The last time was in 2011, like 5 times in the last 2 decades. Doesn't happen very often, but it happened this week, and they kind of gave it to the governor. Tell us what happened. Well,
there were 2 bills at stake, and they had the votes. I mean, they wouldn't go into a veto override session if they didn't have the votes already. So it was assured. In some ways, it was anticlimactic. We kind of knew what the vote was going to be. But basically, these 2 bills, the legislators feel that their powers were infringed on by the governor, that the governor was stepping over the line. And I think they tried to put him back in his place. Well, that's interesting, Boyd, because we really have to get to this, because that's what they said, right? And let's talk about the first bill, which was allowing the legislature to intervene in lawsuits. I guess the lawsuits on the laws that they passed. Were they reclaiming power, or were they taking power?
I think it's one of those where it depends on who you ask and what the day is, because the governor's clearly saying no, they're overstepping. The legislature's saying no, we're clawing back, and I think it's really just one of those classic. Each branch of the government thinks that they should have power when it comes to that particular issue. I was a little surprised that the governor went on this one because it didn't seem like there was a real path to victory for the governor. So it seemed a little odd that he would use a little bit of political capital there on something that he knew he wasn't going to win in the end.
What do you think, Rich?
Well, I think about every 8 to 10 years, the legislature just feels like they need to override something. And there's an opportunity to do it. When we worked with Mike Levitt, it was 11 years before they did it. But at that point in time, I think they just said, look, you're not communicating with us. You're not giving us enough reason on why you're taking this position. We're just going to go into an override session, and they do. But the fact is, I think in this case, I don't think the governor had much to lose. He's staking a claim, and these are ultimately issues are going to be decided by the court, not by the legislature, not by the governor. The courts are going to figure this out. When you were, sorry, Jennifer.
I just wanted to add that I think legislators somewhat felt empowered. There's going to be a lot of turnover. So there are a lot of people making a mass exodus, and they just thought, you know what, I have a statement to make, and I'm going to make it.
Yeah, that's great.
Was this just a statement?
For the most part, for the average Utah, I don't think this one plays a whole lot anywhere. But it is one of those, especially I hadn't thought of that in terms of those that are leaving. Yes. It's just kind of a yes, the legislature matters.
I want to talk about this calculation from the governor, because if maybe we knew the votes, why would you do it? But I want to read a quote after this override session. And Rich, I want to ask you a question about this. This is for the governor from his spokesperson, Paul Edwards. He said, clearly, the governor and the legislature disagree about the appropriate roles and functions of their respective branches of state government. We would encourage the legislature to intervene in a court case as soon as possible so that Utah courts can quickly resolve these important constitutional issues. They're kind of throwing it down right there, it seems.
Triple dog dare.
Triple dog dare. Is that what this is?
I think it kind of is, but it doesn't reference the Attorney General, who's also weighed in and said, look, I've got an opinion on this, and this doesn't work. Courts are going to figure this out. That's all. I mean, at the end of the day, I think this is one of those issues that they knew was a jump ball, and they're throwing it out there. And I think everybody is letting this head to the courts so they can get it figured out.
Boyd, talk about what that means, though, right? This is almost, we want it in court, we want to resolve this. Is this because the governor thinks he's going to win this thing if the court actually does weigh in, that they have overstepped their bounds? Or is this more of the dance?
I think it's more the dance than anything. Again, it's not on a critical issue. It's not something that voters are really keyed in on, or most of them would even understand. Like Rich said, I think it's a bit of a jump ball, and it's one of those where you end up asking again, why are we doing this exercise between the legislative branch and the executive branch so that we can toss it one more time to the courts? And that's becoming a bad pattern, I think, in terms of how we govern, is we tend to do that more and more. Like, well, we'll do this, you do that, and then we'll let the court figure it out. That's not good governance.
Jennifer, the other bill that they overrode was one where they can ask the attorney generals to issue an opinion on their behalf. That's another interesting power play right there, because they're not happy with the governor's getting to do it. Give us the context for that and why they felt like they have to have access straight to the attorney general.
Well, I think the governor's take is the attorney general is his attorney. He represents the interests of the governor, the executive branch, whereas the legislature says, the attorney general represents the state of Utah. And I mean, you can make arguments either way. I do think that Rich has a pretty darn good point that, you know, somebody's going to have to be the decider on this one. And there are genuine disagreements on that.
You know, there's an interesting parallel, because the same thing is playing out at the national level between Trump and his attorney general, who he claims is his attorney and he expects loyalty. The difference is that in that case, it's an appointed attorney general. And many states have appointed attorney generals. We happen to have an elected attorney general who is elected independently. Could be of a different party, different political persuasion. And so I think the attorney general is going to have some opinions about this as well.
So he's weighed in a little bit, Rich, and I'm curious what you think about it, because this is Sean Reyes, who is saying this override kind of puts the separation of powers into question about who is actually representing the state. He says he is, right? But what happens if, according to the legislature, he decides not to enforce a law that the legislature passed?
They're going to take it to court.
We're back there again.
And they're going to file suit, and they're going to be there, and that's where they're going to resolve it.
If you were to advise the attorney general, how would he go about navigating this issue?
This is a tricky needle to thread, because I think the attorney general really does feel like he represents the state first, and that the other things are tangential to that. And so I'm not sure there's any great space for him to claim, other than he needs to make sure he has enough independence in order to do the job to represent the state. So it's a tricky one.
Interesting. I'd love to talk about some of the initiatives, because this week every initiative had to file their signatures. And in Utah, you need 113,143 signatures to get on the ballot from 26 of the 29 Senate districts. That's the way the law reads. And of course, a lot of these groups had more than they needed in terms of signatures. The question's about where. But Rich, you were involved in one of these.
Yeah,
let's talk about Count My Vote.
Yeah, and we ought to disclose that I'm the executive co-chair there, so that people know that there's a bias here that exists. I've been working on this issue for a long time, but one important clarification is that 113,000 represents 10% of the voters in the last general election cycle, and it has to be spread out 10% in each of the 29 Senate districts. And in order to qualify for the ballot, you must have 10% valid signatures from 26 of the 29 Senate districts. It's an onerous, really difficult task, and it'll be interesting to see at the end of the day where all of this really plays out.
I think that this is a really unusual phenomenon for the state of Utah to have 4 initiatives on the ballot. To me, that is a very strong statement that the citizens of Utah do not think that legislators are listening, that they're responding to the pressing issues of the day. And I do think, you know, it may be easier to sign a petition than to actually punch a card and vote for it, but I think there's just generally a feeling of dissatisfaction with our legislators.
I think there's clearly that component of this, is that there are groups who are motivated to move forward because legislative action wasn't happening. And we see it on a wide range of issues. But the really important part of this is that people who have signed this have not said, I support this initiative. They've said, we want the people to decide it.
Right.
And I think that's what really this is all about, is about putting before people a wide range of issues that they can vote on.
Boyd, help us understand the rationale, and you can comment back on this, Rich, too, because the law is set right now. There are two paths, right? This was the compromise that was reached. Rich, you helped do it. So why is this still so important? And why are Utahns still kind of catching on to this thing when clearly we already know what the law is?
Yeah, because there's still court cases. So we're back to the judicial branch one more time. And I think
there's also a legislative pushback.
Definitely.
I mean, lawmakers don't really like these two paths, and so they've been looking for some way to renegotiate it. I think Rich's camp would argue, look, we need to settle this question once and for all.
Yeah, and I think that is what the voters are looking for, is let's settle this thing. And I think it's also the only fair way to really deal with people who are thinking about running for office, because the uncertainty that the path, all the legal challenges put in there, people have to really calculate. Mitt Romney's going to face an interesting day tomorrow because he'll have some delegates who will be mad at him because he did do signatures. But I think it's one of those where it would be political malpractice not to do both, given that is the law. And so, again, it creates uncertainty for candidates, and that's just not good for the process.
This has been so fascinating because the initial process that we went through with an initiative went for a direct primary. There was a legislative compromise that created two paths, that is signatures and a convention. And the signature thresholds are just simply too high right now. It's onerous and it's not inviting people into the system. They're coming more and more, but it's really difficult. And so the new initiative is an effort to rationalize those, the numbers of signatures required to get on the ballot. But we did our homework here, and we had public hearings, we had polls, we went to focus groups, and we found out something really interesting, and something that I wouldn't have realized had it not been for hearing this from people. They like both ways. They don't want to have just the convention, but they also don't want to have just signatures. They like the check and balance of those two things. They like hearing from the convention, but they like knowing that people are going to be on the ballot and that they're going to participate. And that's what this is really about, is about the fact that I'm going to have a chance to vote on these candidates, not just a small group of delegates.
So what does our panel think? Does this one have a high likelihood of passing then in the state of Utah?
I think it depends on your messaging, Rich.
Well, the whole
I do think, fundamentally it depends on how you're going to explain it, and how is it different from the status quo? Because I think voters, they go into a booth, and if they don't know about it, they vote no. There's just, the status quo, I guess it's not that broken if I haven't heard about it.
There's an advantage to the Count My Vote effort in that it's been out there for about 8 years.
Absolutely.
So there's kind of a brand going here. But there is going to be vigorous opposition to each of these initiatives. They are, you can see it coming. And if you look at the history of initiatives, the last 3 weeks become critical. And it's when people start to make their decisions. And I don't think we can make lots of assumptions about this until you get near the end. And I think you're right. The message, though, for Count My Vote is there are two ways. Everybody gets what they want, and everybody gets to participate. If we can sell that message, this thing passes with a big number. But you have to get that message across. But you got other initiatives here that are
let's talk about another one of those, because the messaging is interesting. On the next one, the Utah Patients Coalition. Which doesn't exactly say marijuana, right? But that's the title of this one, Boyd.
Messaging,
right? That's absolutely
Go
right.
back on this on naming. The naming of the initiative that actually goes on the ballot is done by the Legislative Counsel's office, and it happens after the qualification period. So what they say they are right now may change.
Different. Yeah. And I think this is one of those. Jennifer raised this earlier, and it's a really critical point that. Signing something in the spring is very different than pulling the lever for something in the fall. They're just very, very different. And so I think you can look at kind of the sweeping generalities and say, it looks like it has great momentum and it has great public support. November can be a very different, very different
Well, tell us
experience.
what you think is going to happen on this one, because there's support in the state for medicinal marijuana when they're asked that question with a poll that we did with the Tribune. But does that translate to this, and how do you think it's going to wind through this system ultimately?
Yeah, I think the challenge is the sweeping generalities of the spring. Again, that's the easy part. People say people are suffering. Yes, everybody wants to do that. But you also have to remember that saying that we think there should be more testing or that people who are suffering should have access to this, you can actually have that opinion and still be against the initiative for very different reasons. And I think that will be interesting dynamics and very interesting debate moving into the fall is, yeah, I can be for the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes, but that doesn't mean I'm for this ballot initiative.
Is it because of the dispensary option? I mean, just the fine print, do you think that is going to be confusing or putting people off?
Yeah, I think the confusion, because an uncertain voter usually votes no.
Right.
And so I think when you're looking at a 24 or 28-page initiative that will have a lot of difficulties and challenges for some Utahns, I think in the end that becomes a harder sell in the end.
Helps, I think, by virtue of the fact that we got mail-in ballots now, and people can sit there with their cell phone and start to do research and talk to people about them. But this is one of those initiatives that I think, you know, at the end of the day, we are getting some complicated, diverse opinions about marijuana laws around the country. And it just seems like this is one of those places headed for federal action where the federal law, we're going to have some federal laws that begin to coordinate the states. I mean, you know.
You have much more faith in Congress than I do now, honestly.
Marijuana is not available in Utah, but it's available just across the border.
Every border, pretty much.
Pretty much all around us.
Yeah, and it's the same with a lottery. We don't have one, but we do, and we don't have. You know, it's one of those deals. Yeah. So I think that, you know, at the end of the day, there's going to be some effort to try and consolidate this, and the pressure will build, and there'll be a common pain that'll develop out of it, and people will say, we got to have something that regulates this better.
Okay, how about the Utah Decides Healthcare? Also, that's the title, but this is Medicaid expansion, right? That's what this initiative is. Also qualified, Boyd. Let's start with that. How did the state, after all those years of legislative sessions of not going there, they did something this last session, didn't get to the full population. How is this going to play with them and with Utahns? Are they going to be willing to go for this?
Yeah, this one I think is just tricky because it's not getting a lot of oxygen. Yeah, obviously the Count My Vote and the marijuana initiative are going to really be front and center. I think it's tough for this one to get a lot of traction in terms of any real play in November.
I don't know. I don't know. There is this is our money, and Utah is not getting the benefit of what we've paid into the system. We want to care for the poor. We support programs that help people get out of homelessness and addiction and mental illness and all that stuff. I don't know. I mean, again, it really does come down to marketing, doesn't it?
So that's it. It's the message, I guess.
Message people are agreeing on this.
This has always been the perfect collision because it faces compassion versus budget balancing. And it has been the issue that has existed in every state. And if you are on the side of, let's err on the side of compassion, you'll create an entitlement. If you're on the side of, we've got to deal with cost in the healthcare system, you will align there. And this is the perfect balance. What they passed in the legislature will actually have to go to the federal government, have to go to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services under what's called an 1115 waiver request because it has qualifications in it for work and for other things. But the law itself, the initiative is quite different, much broader in terms of its coverage, and it has some things that are interesting in it that I think will end up being part of this, and it freezes certain things. It says that you don't have flexibility with regards to eligibility and rates and benefits and the like. That cuts legislatures out of the ability to tinker and the like, and I think you're going to see some vigorous opposition there, as you will with all of these.
Well, on this one in particular, though, it really does come down to this fundamental: what do you think the role of government is? You know,
it's a perfect.
And I just think you're going to have to navigate that as you consider your vote.
And I think it also brings into light just the challenge of governing by initiative. It is the hardest and least effective form of governing. I completely agree with Jennifer that if the legislature's getting too comfortable playing small ball policy stuff, then the citizens do have to have a mechanism to be able to do that. But the initiative is always very difficult because it's an all or nothing. There's no compromise, there's no amendment process, there's nothing that can be tweaked or adjusted or improved, and I think that becomes the hard part of the equation.
We better talk about the last one, the fourth one. Jennifer, for just a moment, the Better Boundaries Initiative. All right, how is this one playing out there? Does anyone really even understand this?
I don't know. I mean, for people who look at a map of the state of Utah and they look at where the boundaries for elective office are, they'll go, how How did that happen? You know?
Right.
So I do think that just on the face of it, you could draw a conclusion that maybe this system is a little bit broken and needs to be tweaked. Now, better boundaries, I think the burden for them is going to be, is this the solution? Is having an independent commission that comes up with boundaries, having legislative oversight look at that, is that the best way? But I do think, you know, if they just flash the map, it's pretty evident that these boundaries are skewed. People call it redistricting or gerrymandering, whatever you want to call it.
Pick your title.
I do think that this is an issue that the legislative bodies, they're not going to touch.
They don't want to touch it. Yeah.
They do not want to touch it. It's toxic. And so citizens do feel like, well, you know, maybe it's time for us to step up. It's going to be a hard message, though, because it's technical and it's process and it's not just story oriented.
Right. And then, Boyd, they get down to, well, what lines do you draw with an independent district redistricting group too, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, who gets to decide anyway?
Right. That's right. That's right. And I think a lot of voters will say, well, if I was drawing it, what would I do? And would it be that much different? Is there really a good, fair way to do this? And so again, I think it's one that's just it's a tough sell. I think it's a tough road to hoe.
It's an every decade ritual that is really difficult. I think the initiative has the fairness argument about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they can sell that. But it's an all or nothing. I mean, this is really basically send to the legislature a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of proposal. So it's a very interesting, but I think they've got some compelling arguments. But again, I just lay out, we are a long way from November when it comes to these initiatives.
So true. Yeah. Well, we got a preview of what's going to happen this November, this past weekend at the county convention, and this weekend with the state convention. Very interesting time. I know that you all participate in this process very well. Boyd, give us a little preview, what you think is going to happen, and what you're hearing from the Republican convention this time. But particularly, I'm curious about the Mitt Romney reception by delegates.
Yeah, conventions, Republican and Democrat, trying to figure out how they're going to play out is like smelling the color 7. It is you never know. And Rich has seen this, and Jennifer has seen this. You go in thinking something's going to happen, and then something weird happens, and it goes very different. I think for Mitt Romney, I think the real question will be, there's going to be so many battles within the party, between the leadership, between the state central committee. Mitt could end up being kind of the cat that gets kicked in the end, because you could have some really angry, frustrated delegates who have just gone through a big battle. They may look at Mitt Romney and say, well, he gathered signatures, he's on the ballot anyway, let's punish him, let's put someone else through. I don't know how that's all going to play. I think if I were Mitt, I would suggest he starts his speech tomorrow with, I have no applause lines in this speech.
Just to make sure we know why we're not getting any.
Yeah, exactly. But then he should lay out a really serious case that this isn't a time for a lot of hoopla and rah-rahs. We need to have a serious conversation, because I think that's the essence of what his campaign has tried to be about, and I think that's ultimately what will happen.
I actually think he's going to do just fine. I don't think. Well, I do think that there are people who see the Massachusetts governor who's super moderate, the flip-flopper in the presidential campaign. So there are vestiges of that. But he's super conservative on immigration, like way more than even Trump is. And so I think that will appeal to part of that base.
You think he gets to 60?
I would say 58.
58. All right. So we'll have an interesting primary. Most likely, Mike Kennedy, most likely.
Most likely, right?
Yeah.
But this is a guy who, and the presidential candidate, he got nearly 70% of the vote in the state of Utah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's the same Gary Herbert thing. Gary Herbert did not make it out of convention.
He goes into a very popular governor and ends up with 44% of the delegate vote. This is why we're doing Count My Vote, okay? Because you need to have the vehicle to ultimately allows people to decide these choices. But it's really interesting to see what the convention will do, and it's interesting to see that people can get on the ballot another way.
How angry do you think those delegates are going to be on Saturday?
I don't think. Listen, I'm not sure that we know the composition of that delegate base right now.
It's different, yeah.
There was, anecdotally, we all have experiences from our own meetings, smaller, older group of people, and my experience just talking to people is that a lot of people took the delegate assignment as Okay, if nobody else will do it, I will. And that means that these weren't die-hard people, but that there may be a lot of Romney people in that group. They worked hard to try and get that to happen, and this has been a campaign that's been working hard. So I think you're right. I think they could actually do very well, and it wouldn't surprise me to see them do some significant numbers. It wouldn't surprise me to see the other thing too.
Smell the color 7, right?
That's right. What we're going to be doing. Jennifer, something interesting is happening with the Democratic Party in several really high-profile cases. Is we have numerous candidates coming forward in the Democratic convention for Senator Debakis' seat in particular. Very interesting. Jennifer Plum, Brian Kitchen, both contending.
Actually, Derek Kitchen.
Jennifer Plum, Derek Kitchen. That's right. How is this working out, and why are we getting so many Democrats there, and how is that changing the landscape for us?
Well, an open seat is like catnip to a politician, right? You just can't resist. You got to get in there, and especially an open Senate seat that is in a traditionally liberal neighborhood. The Avenues district is pretty locked up for the Democrats, I would say, and so I don't know. I mean, I'm not surprised that there are multiple candidates jumping in. I do think that Democrats are still soul searching a little bit. Like, how far left should we be? Or should we be more of those compromisers? Should we be looking at a middle of the road Democrat, sort of in the Jim Matheson recipe, and can that work in the state legislature?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and I think that's something that's happening nationally as well. Is you had in California, you had Dianne Feinstein not getting her party support because she wasn't liberal enough. I think it's great that the Democratic Party here in Utah is having multiple candidates, because that's good for debate, it's good for dialogue, and it's good for the state. And so I hope that continues and gets parlayed into some more good conversations.
I was just going to say once again, I think this is a rationale for saying we want to expand the voter participation base relative to people who become candidates. So I think it's I think it's great. I love to hear the conversation about different candidates and different views.
Okay, that's going to have to be the last comment. Thank you for your insights today. Thanks, Jason. That's it for tonight's show. For more discussion and past episodes, please join us online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. We'll see you next week. Thank you and good night.